I really can't thank you enough for stepping in yesterday.
I'm just glad I was there to help.
In the cutthroat world of Manhattan's corporate elite, vulnerability is a death sentence. When a struggling single father risked his only source of income to rescue his untouchable billionaire boss from a predatory trap, he expected to be fired or completely ignored. Instead, the next morning, she demanded his undivided attention. David Sullivan was a man intimately acquainted with the background of other people's lives. At 34, he was a senior data analyst for Sterling Omnimedia, a sprawling conglomerate that owned everything from boutique publishing houses to cutting-edge streaming platforms. It was a good job, a necessary job, but in the grand hierarchy of the Sterling Empire, David was entirely invisible. He liked it that way. Invisibility meant stability, and stability was the only thing keeping the roof over his head and his 6-year-old daughter, Chloe, enrolled in a decent school in Astoria, Queens. Life as a single father left no room for corporate heroics. Ever since his wife passed away from an aggressive illness 3 years prior, leaving behind a mountain of medical debt, David's existence had been reduced to a strict algorithm. Wake up, make oatmeal, drop Chloe at before care, commute on the N train, analyze consumer retention algorithms for 9 hours, commute home, read bedtime stories, and exhaustedly fall asleep. He was a man running on fumes and black coffee. On a rainy Friday night in November, the algorithm was disrupted. Sterling Omnimedia was hosting its annual philanthropic gala at the Pierre Hotel on the Upper East Side. While the city's billionaires, socialites, and media tycoons clinked champagne flutes in the grand ballroom, David was stationed in a windowless logistics room down the hall, managing the live data feed for the charity auction. The undisputed center of the gala was his boss, Victoria Sterling. At 32, Victoria had inherited her father's media empire and ruthlessly doubled its market cap in 5 years. She was a billionaire CEO infamous for her glacial demeanor, terrifying intellect, and absolute lack of personal entanglements. The financial press called her the Iron Heiress. David had never spoken to her. He had only ever seen her stepping out of armored town cars or delivering pristine, uncompromising keynote speeches. She was less a human being and more a localized weather event, powerful, distant, and capable of destroying careers with a single email. By 1:30 a.m., the gala was winding down, the live feed had ended, and David was finally packing his laptop into his worn leather messenger bag. He was exhausted. The babysitter, a kind neighbor named Mrs. Gable, was charging him time and a half past midnight, and his bank account was already stretched thin. Taking a shortcut toward the employee exit, David navigated the labyrinthine, softly lit corridors of the VIP mezzanine. The music from the ballroom was a muffled, distant bass line. The hallway was entirely empty, save for a small group huddled near a heavy set of brass doors that led to a private service elevator. David froze in the shadows of a marble pillar. It was Victoria Sterling, but she didn't look like the untouchable CEO on the cover of Forbes. She was leaning heavily against the flocked wallpaper, her head lolling to the side. Her usually immaculate posture was gone, and her eyes were glazed, blinking slowly as if fighting a heavy, unnatural weight. Flanking her were 2 broad-shouldered men in tailored suits, and standing directly in front of her, gripping her waist with uncomfortable familiarity, was Richard Croft. David recognized him immediately. Croft was the CEO of Vanguard Holdings, a predatory hedge fund that had been aggressively trying to force a hostile merger with Sterling Omnimedia for the past 8 months. Croft was notorious in the financial district, a man who played dirty, leveraging scandals and exploiting weaknesses to consume rival companies. "Just walk, Victoria," Croft said, his voice low and soothing, but edged with a commanding steel. "My car is downstairs. We're going to get you out of here, get you back to my place, and talk about the future." Victoria weakly brought a hand up, pushing feebly against Croft's chest. Her voice was slurred, completely stripped of its usual sharp authority. "No, where is Thomas?" "My driver." Thomas went home. "Your security team knows I'm taking over," Croft lied smoothly, nodding to one of the large men who immediately keyed the service elevator. The doors slid open with a quiet ding. "You've had too much to drink. You need a friend right now." David felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He wasn't naive. He knew what heavily intoxicated looked like, and he knew what heavily medicated looked like. Victoria Sterling was a notorious control freak who supposedly never drank more than half a glass of wine in public. The way her legs were giving out, the total lack of coordination, she had been drugged. The realization paralyzed him. If he stepped in, he was picking a fight with a hedge fund billionaire and two professional fixers. He was a data analyst. If he misread the situation, or if Croft simply decided to crush him, David would be fired by Monday morning. He would lose his health insurance. He would lose Chloe's stability. Walk away, his brain screamed. It's not your world. It's not your business. Croft wrapped his arm tighter around Victoria, practically lifting her off the ground to drag her into the elevator. Victoria's head rolled, and for a fraction of a second, her glassy eyes met David's in the shadows. There was a raw, naked panic in them. David thought of his daughter. He thought of the kind of man he was trying to raise her to believe in. He dropped his messenger bag. It hit the carpeted floor with a heavy thud. "Mr. Croft!" David's voice rang out down the quiet corridor, sharper and more confident than he felt. He stepped out from behind the pillar, walking briskly toward the group with his phone pressed to his ear, acting frantic. Croft turned, his eyes narrowing into venomous slits. The two large men immediately squared their shoulders, stepping between Croft and David. "Who the hell are you?" Croft demanded, his grip tightening on Victoria, who was now barely conscious, her chin resting against her chest. "David Sullivan, Sterling Omni Media, Server Diagnostics," David rattled off, barely stopping his forward momentum. He locked his eyes onto Victoria, ignoring the muscle. "Miss Sterling, thank God I found you. The European data centers just experienced a catastrophic breach. Legal is on the line right now. They said if you don't authorize the lockdown protocols in the next 90 seconds, we're in violation of EU privacy laws." It was a complete fabrication, a string of corporate buzzwords David hoped would sound urgent enough to confuse them. Croft sneered, "Not buying it for a second. Miss Sterling is indisposed. Handle it yourself, or I'll ensure you're fired tomorrow." "I can't authorize it, sir," David insisted, stepping right up to the line of the security men. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "And with all due respect, if the SEC finds out the CEO ignored a data breach because she was leaving a party, the stock will tank by dawn. You own Vanguard, Mr. Croft. You know exactly what a delayed response does to shareholder value." The mention of the stock price made Croft hesitate. It was the only language the man truly understood. Taking advantage of the microsecond of doubt, David slipped past the first security guard, who was too slow to physically strike a corporate employee in a public hotel hallway. David reached Victoria and gently but firmly took her arm. "Miss Sterling," David said loudly, directly into her ear. "Do you need me to call the police regarding the breach, or are you coming with me to the secure line?" Victoria blinked heavily. Through the fog of whatever chemical was coursing through her veins, a sliver of her legendary intellect seemed to grasp the lifeline. She leaned her weight entirely away from Croft and slumped against David. "The breach," she mumbled, her fingers weakly gripping David's cheap suit jacket. "Take me to the line. She's clearly intoxicated." "Let her go, son," Croft growled, dropping the polite facade. He stepped forward, his face inches from David's. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. Walk away right now, and I'll forget I saw your face. Stay, and I promise you will never work in this city again." "I appreciate the career advice," David said, his voice trembling slightly, but his grip on Victoria remaining ironclad. "But my boss gave me a direct order." David turned, supporting almost all of Victoria's weight, and began walking back down the long corridor toward the main lobby, praying the two men wouldn't draw weapons or jump him from behind. The silence behind them was agonizing, but David knew Croft couldn't risk a physical altercation in the middle of a highly monitored hotel, not when Victoria was technically a willing participant in walking away. "You're making a massive mistake, Sullivan." Croft's voice echoed down the hall, dripping with malice. David didn't look back. He dragged Victoria through the staff corridors, bypassing the main lobby entirely. They emerged out of the kitchen loading dock into the freezing, pouring rain of a New York November. "Miss Sterling," David panted, shivering as the cold rain instantly soaked through his shirt. "Where is your security? I need to call Thomas." Victoria leaned against the brick wall of the alley, sliding down slightly. She grabbed David's tie, pulling him down to her level. Her breath was warm and smelled faintly of expensive gin, but her eyes were wild with terror. "No!" she rasped, her words jumbled. "No, Thomas! Croft was talking to him earlier. My detail. Compromised. They let him take me. David froze. If her own private security had been bought off by Vanguard Holdings, he couldn't take her to her Upper East Side penthouse. He couldn't take her to a hospital, either. A billionaire CEO admitted for suspected drugging would trigger mandatory police reports, a media circus, and an instant panic among the board of directors. Croft would use the scandal to claim she was unfit to lead and force the hostile takeover anyway. "Okay," David said, his mind racing. "Okay, I'm going to get us a cab." He flagged down a battered yellow taxi, splashing through the puddles on Fifth Avenue. It was infinitely safer and less trackable than ordering a rideshare on his phone. He practically carried Victoria into the back seat, sliding in next to her. "Where to, buddy?" the driver asked, eyeing them suspiciously through the rearview mirror. David looked at the billionaire passed out against his shoulder, her multi-thousand-dollar designer gown dripping onto the cracked vinyl seats. He thought of his tiny, cluttered apartment. He thought of the terrifying men he had just made enemies of. "Astoria," David said, giving the driver his home address. The ride over the Queensboro Bridge was agonizing. Victoria drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally shivering violently. David took off his damp jacket and draped it over her, his mind spiraling into panic. What the hell was he doing? He had just kidnapped the CEO of his company. If she woke up and misunderstood the situation, he would be facing federal charges. They arrived at his walk-up apartment building just after 2:30 a.m. David paid the driver with cash, helping Victoria out of the car and half carrying her up 3 flights of narrow, creaking stairs. He quietly unlocked his front door, praying Chloe wouldn't wake up. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books. It was clean but undeniably cramped. Toys were corralled into a corner of the living room, and a stack of past-due utility bills sat prominently on the small dining table. Mrs. Gable was asleep on the sofa. She woke up with a start as David maneuvered Victoria into the entryway. "David? Oh my heavens, who is this?" the older woman whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the glamorous, unconscious woman. "A coworker." David lied smoothly, keeping his voice to a whisper. She had a terrible reaction to some medication at a work event. "I couldn't leave her alone, and she didn't want to go to the ER." Mrs. Gable, bless her trusting heart, didn't press the issue. David paid her the overtime he couldn't afford and locked the door behind her. He carried Victoria into his own bedroom. It was a modest space, dominated by a heavy wooden bed frame and a dresser covered in framed photos of Chloe. He gently laid Victoria on top of the covers. He didn't dare remove her wet dress, settling instead for taking off her ruined heels and pulling a thick, warm quilt over her shivering form. He placed a glass of water and 2 aspirins on the nightstand, along with a sticky note that read, "You are safe. I am David from Data Analytics." Lock the door from the inside. He gently closed the bedroom door behind him, leaving her alone. Exhausted to his very bones, David walked into the living room and collapsed onto the lumpy sofa. The adrenaline was finally wearing off, replaced by a crushing wave of dread. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the rain hit the window pane. He had saved her, but as he closed his eyes, David was absolutely certain he had just ruined his own life. Saturday morning arrived with the unforgiving glare of harsh sunlight cutting through the cheap blinds of David's living room. He woke up with a stiff neck on the lumpy sofa, a terrifying jolt of adrenaline hitting him the second his eyes snapped open. He hadn't dreamed it. The CEO of Sterling Omni Media was asleep in his bed. Before panic could fully set in, a small, warm hand patted his cheek. "Daddy, why are you sleeping on the couch? Did you get in trouble?" David groaned, sitting up and pulling his 6-year-old daughter into a hug. Chloe was already dressed in her mismatched weekend pajamas, her curly brown hair, a chaotic halo around her head. "Just fell asleep watching TV, bug," David lied smoothly, kissing her forehead. "How about pancakes? Extra syrup?" "Yes!" Chloe cheered, sprinting toward the tiny kitchenette. David rubbed his face, his mind racing. He had to figure out how to get Victoria Sterling out of his apartment without traumatizing his daughter or getting arrested. He put on a pot of coffee, the cheap beans smelling distinctly burnt, and began mixing batter. Every creak of the floorboards from the bedroom made his heart skip a beat. Inside the bedroom, Victoria Sterling opened her eyes to an unfamiliar ceiling. Her head pounded with a vicious, chemical ache, unlike any hangover she had ever experienced. The memories of the previous night hit her in jagged, terrifying fragments. The gala, The sudden wave of paralyzing dizziness, Croft's suffocating grip, the terrifying realization that her own security team was ignoring her distress. Then, the sudden intervention, the fake data breach, the rain, the taxi. She sat up sharply, wincing as the room spun. She was still wearing her ruined, damp Oscar de la Renta gown. Beside her on the nightstand was a glass of water, 2 aspirins, and a yellow post-it note. "You are safe. I am David from Data Analytics. Lock the door from the inside." Victoria stared at the note. In her world, weakness was a commodity to be exploited. If someone saved you, it was only because they wanted to own the debt. She expected to wake up to a blackmail demand, or worse, in a hospital bed with a media circus outside her door. Her company's stock tanking while Richard Croft launched his hostile takeover. Instead, she smelled pancakes. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, finding her feet bare. She cautiously unlocked the bedroom door and stepped into the narrow hallway. The apartment was jarringly small. It lacked the vaulted ceilings, the minimalist art, and the sterile perfection of her penthouse. It felt remarkably, intensely lived in. She turned the corner into the living room and froze. David was at the stove, expertly flipping a pancake while a little girl sat at a cramped dining table, aggressively coloring a picture of a dinosaur. He looked completely different in the daylight, tired, wearing a faded gray t-shirt and sweatpants, his dark hair messy. "You're awake," David said, catching sight of her. He nearly dropped the spatula. He immediately stiffened, reverting to the panicked employee from the night before. "Miss Sterling, I didn't want to wake you. How are you feeling?" Chloe looked up, her eyes widening at the glamorous stranger in the glittering, albeit wrinkled, dress. "Are you a princess?" Victoria, who regularly stared down ruthless hedge fund managers and hostile boards of directors without blinking, found herself momentarily speechless. "No," she managed to say, her voice gravelly. "I am a co-worker of your father's. You look like a princess," Chloe insisted, returning to her dinosaur. "My name is Chloe." "Victoria," she replied, her gaze shifting back to David. Her mind was clicking into its usual high gear, calculating the variables. "You didn't take me to a hospital. You didn't call the police. You didn't even call my executive assistant. You told me your security detail was compromised," David said quietly, stepping away from the stove and handing Chloe a plate of pancakes before walking toward Victoria. He kept his voice low. "If Croft bought off your security, I figured he might have eyes on your assistant or your penthouse. A hospital would have triggered a police report and a press leak. I panicked. So I brought you here. It was the only place I knew he wouldn't look." Victoria studied him. She looked for the hustle, the underlying demand for money, or a promotion. She found nothing but genuine, exhausted concern. "You're an analyst," she said. "Server diagnostics?" "Senior data analyst, yes." "And you risked your job and your physical safety to confront Richard Croft, a man who is notoriously vindictive, based on a split-second assessment of my motor functions?" "I saw you were in trouble," David said simply, meeting her piercing gaze. "I couldn't just walk away and live with myself." Victoria took a slow breath, the reality of how close she had come to losing everything washing over her. Croft hadn't just wanted to compromise her. He wanted to ruin her credibility, to film her in a compromising state, or force her to sign away her voting rights under duress. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. The Iron Heiress didn't have time for trauma. She only had time for retaliation. "Give me a cup of that coffee," Victoria commanded, her tone suddenly snapping back to the absolute authority that made her a billionaire. "Black." And then, "David from Data Analytics, you are going to help me destroy Richard Croft." The tiny kitchen table was quickly converted into a war room. Chloe was happily sequestered in the living room, with a cartoon on the television, completely oblivious to the corporate warfare being waged 10 feet away. Victoria sat at the table, wrapped in one of David's oversized flannel shirts, while her ruined dress hung in the bathroom. Despite the messy hair and the flannel, she commanded the room with terrifying precision. "Croft is arrogant, but he isn't stupid," Victoria said, rapidly typing on David's personal laptop. "He wouldn't have made a move like that unless he had a guaranteed way to cover his tracks. He knew my driver was gone. He knew my security detail would look the other way. That level of coordination requires high-level, internal access to my itinerary." "You think you have a mole," David said, sitting across from her with a fresh mug of coffee. I know I have a mole, Victoria corrected coldly, and they are likely on the executive board. If I show up on Monday morning acting like nothing happened, they'll know I'm on to them. If I go to the police now, without proof of the internal conspiracy, Croft's lawyers will bury it as a misunderstanding, and the board will vote me out for erratic behavior. I need hard data. I need proof of who authorized the security change. You want me to hack into Sterling Omnimedia? David asked, his eyes widening. Miss Sterling, I analyze consumer retention. I don't break into executive servers. You don't need to break in, David. You already have the keys, Victoria said, turning the laptop toward him. You have low-level access to the server diagnostic logs, correct? To check for system lag and data traffic? Yes, but nobody monitors the monitors, Victoria finished, a sharp, predatory smile touching her lips. If I log in with my CEO credentials, the mole will get an alert, but a senior data analyst checking server traffic on a Saturday morning? Completely invisible. David stared at the screen. He was terrified, but he was also inexplicably drawn into her orbit. For the first time in his life, he wasn't invisible, he was instrumental. Okay, David breathed, pulling the laptop closer. What are we looking for? Cross-reference the security department's shift logs with the executive email server. Look for any communication regarding my details sent between 8 p.m. and midnight last night. For the next 3 hours, the apartment was silent except for the frantic clicking of the keyboard and the distant sound of cartoons. David's fingers flew across the keys, his analytical mind sorting through mountains of encrypted metadata. He was in his element. Victoria watched him, genuinely impressed. The man who had been a faceless name on a payroll spreadsheet was navigating her company's complex architecture with surgical precision. Got something? David suddenly said, his posture stiffening. There's a discrepancy. The security detail was officially swapped at 11:15 p.m. The authorization came from a centralized internal IP address, but it bypassed the standard security protocol. Can you trace the IP to a specific terminal? Victoria asked, leaning over his shoulder. He could smell the lingering scent of her expensive perfume mixed with the burnt coffee. Wait. David frowned, highlighting a string of code. The authorization wasn't just an email, it was an automated script. Someone set it up days ago to execute precisely at 11:15 p.m., perfectly timed for when you'd be in the VIP mezzanine. Who wrote the script? David's fingers danced across the keys, bypassing a low-level firewall by bouncing his query through the European servers. Ironically, the very same servers he had lied about the night before. He hit Enter. A name populated on the screen. David stopped breathing. He slowly looked up at Victoria. It was Arthur Pendleton, David said quietly. Victoria's face drained of color. Arthur Pendleton was her chief operating officer. He had been her father's best friend. He had mentored her. Arthur, she whispered, her voice betraying a microscopic fracture of emotion before instantly hardening back into ice. He's the only one besides me with unilateral authority over executive security. He's been pushing for the Vanguard merger for months. He said it was for the good of the company. He sold you out to Croft, David said. If Croft took you last night and compromised you, Arthur would have been named interim CEO by Monday morning. He would have rammed the merger through before you could even defend yourself. Victoria stood up, pacing the small kitchen. The betrayal was massive, but the data was irrefutable. She now had the weapon she needed, but she was still a target, and the weekend wasn't over. We have the proof, Victoria said, stopping to look at David. But I can't launch the counterstrike from a laptop in Queens. I need to get to my legal team, and I need to do it before Arthur realizes I never went home with Croft. Suddenly, David's cell phone buzzed on the table. It wasn't a number he recognized. He answered it cautiously. Hello? Mr. Sullivan. A smooth, chillingly familiar voice purred on the other end. It was Richard Croft. You've been a very difficult man to track down, but I see your daughter Chloe is registered at the Astoria Elementary Magnet Program. Lovely school. David's blood ran ice cold. He looked at Chloe, who was giggling at the TV, completely safe, completely unaware. If you touch her, David said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly register he didn't know he possessed, I will kill you. Nobody wants to hurt anyone, David, Croft lied smoothly, but you have something that belongs to me, and I'm sitting in a black SUV at the end of your street. Send her down, and you and your daughter can go back to your invisible little lives. David hung up the phone. He looked at Victoria. "They're outside," David said. "We can't go out the front," David whispered, his mind violently shifting from panicked employee to a fiercely protective father. He moved toward the hallway closet, grabbing a faded denim jacket and a dark Yankees baseball cap. He tossed them to Victoria. "Put these on. That dress is a beacon, and your face is too recognizable." Victoria didn't hesitate. She shed the oversized flannel, pulling on the jacket and jamming the cap over her signature blonde hair. She looked entirely out of place, but the disguise was necessary. David knelt beside the coffee table, forcing a wide, perfectly calm smile onto his face as he looked at his daughter. "Chloe, Bug, look at me. We're going to play a secret agent game. We have to leave the apartment through the fire escape, and we have to be quieter than a shadow. Can you do that?" Chloe's eyes lit up, dropping her crayon. "Like a ninja?" "Exactly like a ninja," David said, his heart hammering against his ribs. He scooped her up, holding her tightly against his chest. Not a single sound. He led them to the small window in his bedroom that overlooked the back alley. The rusted iron of the fire escape groaned quietly as David stepped out into the crisp, damp November morning air, clutching Chloe. Victoria followed, her oversized, borrowed sneakers slipping slightly on the wet metal. They descended 3 flights of stairs in agonizing silence. When they reached the bottom, David didn't lower the squeaky drop ladder. Instead, he hung off the edge and dropped the remaining 8 feet into the alleyway, landing with a soft thud. He reached up, caught Chloe as Victoria lowered her down, and then helped the billionaire CEO jump into a pile of discarded cardboard to muffle her landing. They sprinted down the narrow alley, moving in the opposite direction of the main street where Croft's black SUV was idling. They didn't stop running until they reached the entrance of the Astoria Boulevard subway station. As they swiped through the turnstiles and rushed onto an idling N train, the doors sliding shut just behind them, David finally let out a ragged breath. He set Chloe down on the plastic orange seat. She was giggling, entirely thrilled by the ninja mission. Victoria sat beside him, catching her breath. The Iron Heiress was sitting on a graffiti-scratched subway car in Queens, wearing a borrowed denim jacket and ill-fitting sneakers. Yet, somehow, she still radiated absolute authority. "Where are we going?" David asked, pulling his laptop tightly against his chest. "Park Avenue. The offices of Kravitz, Hughes and Partners," Victoria said, her eyes dark and calculating. "Maxwell Hughes is my lead corporate attorney. He's not on the board, he has no ties to Vanguard, and he hates Arthur Pendleton. If anyone can facilitate an emergency board meeting on a Saturday morning, it's Maxwell." As the train rattled over the East River, offering a sweeping view of the Manhattan skyline, David opened his laptop. The adrenaline was stabilizing, allowing his analytical mind to take over again. "If we're going to blow Arthur out of the water, we need more than just the server logs," David muttered, his fingers flying across the trackpad. "Croft is a shark. He'll claim the logs were fabricated. We need a financial motive. Why would an incredibly wealthy COO risk federal prison to facilitate a hostile takeover?" Victoria frowned, leaning closer to the screen. Arthur's wealth is tied entirely to Sterling Omnimedia stock. If the company merges with Vanguard, his shares vest immediately, but he still loses his operational control. It never made sense to me. Unless... David quickly bypassed another layer of standard security, accessing the executive financial disclosures that were meant for internal auditors. "Unless he's broke," Victoria scoffed. "Arthur makes $8 million a year in base salary. And he spent 12, David said, pointing to a cascading series of red flags on the screen. "Look at this." He leveraged his unvested shares against a series of catastrophic commercial real estate investments in Chicago last year. He's underwater by nearly $40 million. The Vanguard merger includes a massive golden parachute for the executive board. He didn't sell you out for power, Victoria. He sold you out to avoid bankruptcy. Victoria stared at the numbers. The final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. Her expression didn't soften. It turned to absolute diamond. "He tried to feed me to the wolves to cover a bad bet," she whispered. An hour later, they were standing in the cavernous, glass-walled conference room of Kravitz, Hughes and Partners. Maxwell Hughes, a sharp-featured man in his 60s wearing a weekend cashmere sweater, had listened to their story in horrified silence. Within 20 minutes, he had secured a heavily encrypted video link and initiated an emergency, mandatory remote meeting of the Sterling Omni-Media Board of Directors. On the massive plasma screen at the end of the table, 8 separate video feeds popped up. Most of the board members looked confused, sitting in their home offices or living rooms. In the center square was Arthur Pendleton, looking perfectly composed in a tailored suit from his home study. "Maxwell, what is the meaning of this?" Arthur demanded, his voice projecting through the speakers. "Where is Victoria?" She missed her morning briefing, and her security detail reported a highly erratic departure from the gala last night. Frankly, I was about to call the police. Victoria stepped into the frame of the camera. She had removed the baseball cap, but she was still wearing David's faded jacket. The contrast was jarring, and the silence on the video call was deafening. "Cancel the police, Arthur." "I'm right here," Victoria said, her voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Arthur's composed facade slipped for a microsecond. His eyes widened, a flash of genuine panic betraying him before he recovered. "Victoria, thank God. We were incredibly worried. Where have you been? Why are you dressed like that?" "I was avoiding a kidnapping orchestrated by Richard Croft," Victoria stated flatly, ignoring the sudden gasps from the other board members. She leaned over the conference table, staring directly into the camera lens. "A kidnapping facilitated by a localized security breach that bypassed protocol at exactly 11:15 p.m. A breach authorized by your personal administrative credentials, Arthur. That is an outrageous accusation." Arthur stammered, his face flushing dark red. "My credentials must have been hacked. This is a fabrication." "Is it?" Victoria asked. She tapped a key on the laptop in front of her. Instantly, Maxwell Hughes transmitted the file David had compiled directly to every board member's secure inbox. "You're looking at the server logs, traced directly to the IP address in your Upper East Side townhouse," Victoria narrated, her tone merciless. "But more importantly, you're looking at your private financial disclosures. 40 million in the red, Arthur. Croft promised you a golden parachute in the Vanguard merger to save you from personal ruin, and all you had to do was serve me up on a silver platter so he could compromise my voting rights." "Victoria, listen to me," Arthur pleaded, the panic now fully consuming him. "No, Arthur, you listen," she interrupted, her voice echoing with absolute finality. "As of this second, you are terminated for cause. Maxwell has already forwarded these documents to the SEC, the FBI, and the NYPD. They will be at your townhouse in approximately 10 minutes. Victoria didn't wait for his response. She reached forward and severed the connection, plunging the conference room back into silence. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the blank screen. The empire was safe. The traitors were exposed. The Iron Heiress had won. Slowly, she turned around. David was sitting in a leather chair by the window, quietly coloring on a legal pad with Chloe to keep her entertained. He looked up, his exhausted eyes meeting hers. He didn't look at her like she was a titan of industry. He looked at her like she was just a person who had survived a terrible night. "So," David said softly, offering a tired, genuine smile. "Do I still have a job on Monday?" Victoria walked over to him. For the first time since he had seen her at the gala, the glacial mask melted away, revealing a profoundly genuine, albeit small, smile. "David, as of Monday, server diagnostics no longer exists," Victoria said smoothly. "You are the new director of cybersecurity and internal auditing, and your first task will be helping me legally dismantle Vanguard Holdings until Richard Croft is nothing but a footnote in a textbook." David blinked, the magnitude of the promotion washing over him. It meant financial security. It meant a future for Chloe. "I think I can handle that," David replied. What began as a terrifying intervention in a quiet hotel corridor transformed the trajectory of 2 vastly different lives. David Sullivan stepped out of his invisible background, securing not only his daughter's future, but proving that integrity holds immeasurable power. Victoria Sterling, the untouchable billionaire, learned that true loyalty cannot be bought, it must be earned. Together, they didn't just survive a hostile corporate takeover, they redefined the very foundation of the Sterling Empire.
Hi, my name is Shalom Royal Hunger, the owner and manager of Shalom Royal Hunger. After watching the video, Single Dad Saves His Drunk Boss from Trouble, the next day she didn't pretend to forget, I'd really like to know what you think. How did the story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the quiet dignity in the way the single dad handled the situation. He could have taken advantage of the moment, or simply walked away, but instead he chose kindness and responsibility, without expecting anything in return. I think that's what gave the story its emotional core. Sometimes the strongest impressions come from how people behave when nobody is forcing them to do the right thing. Do you think the boss saw him differently the next day because of what he did, or because of the kind of person he revealed himself to be? And have you ever had someone remember a moment of kindness long after you thought it was forgotten? Stories like this remind us that respect, empathy, and integrity often matter more than status or appearances. If this story connected with you emotionally, I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional stories about second chances, human connection, and quiet acts of kindness, feel free to like and subscribe, only if you'd like to see more.